We have had record people coming to New Zealand and now leaving, and we're going to find out what that's going to mean for the long time here in New Zealand, or the future of New Zealand. We've got Professor Paul Spoonley back in the hot seat. Mate, good to see you again.
Good to see you, Luke. Good to see you.
You've been around the world again, I believe?
I have. I've been 2.5 months in Europe, and most of that in Sweden at the major migration centre in Sweden.
Wow. What happens at the major migration centre?
They do research on migration, but in Sweden and the Nordic countries generally, most of the migrants are refugees, quite unlike New Zealand. And of course, they've all got governments, or nearly all of them have got governments, which are anti-immigrant.
Wow.
So it doesn't matter where you go, whether you go down to Italy and Maloney, or AfD in Germany, or Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, and of course in Sweden.
Yeah.
They've got governments which are now anti-immigrant. But, and I don't know whether you want to talk about this.
No, this is great.
But it's right at the point where they all need immigrants because of the demographic changes that are
happening.
happening. And so what you'll see throughout Europe is a very significant decline in the working age population. Now, to give you a sense of the size of that, between 2023, 2 years ago, and 2050, there'll be 8 million fewer Germans of working age.
Wow.
So how do you make that up? Well, you can use technology, and AI and other developments will help, but you still need people. You still need people, for example, in the health system.
Yeah.
So where do you get those people from? So at the very moment that you're going to have to think about making up for workforce shortages, one of your few options, which is immigrants, they're not keen on.
So do they, as a country, they decide that they're not too keen on immigrants? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Well, what's happening throughout Europe is that conservative and right-wing parties, which are anti-immigrant, that's their main position, not their only position, but their main position, are being elected. So you're getting a turn in Europe, which is seeing these anti-immigrant politics. And then, of course, we've got an election coming up in the USA, and it's again going to be interesting to see whether we get a government which identifies immigrants as a problem, not as an opportunity, not as a contributor to economic and social growth, which is what we tend to see in New Zealand.
Yeah.
But in Europe, it's very, very different.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I don't think we don't really have that conversation here, do we, around, or is there that underlying tone, like it does pop up every now and then?
Well, it did pop up. If you remember, between 93 and 96, we saw New Zealand First emerging, and it came out of an article in Auckland community newspapers called Invasion. So the idea that Asians were invading here. And we had that panic. I would describe it as a moral panic,
Yeah.
So we've certainly had a party which has in the past been anti-immigrant, but if you think about 2024, migration or anti-immigrant sentiments are really not something that you hear very much about.
Yeah. Wow. Well,
Yes.
I've been doing my research, mate. You're going to be proud. And I believe that I read that the Asian population in New Zealand is set to double from 2013 to 2043.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
So they're the fastest growing set of communities. And here in Auckland, they will make up around 40% of the total population. And then for New Zealand as a whole, about a quarter of all New Zealanders will be from one of those Asian communities.
Is that by what sort of year, 2043, like around there?
Yeah, that's true. We're using 2043 because that then takes us from the last census.
I see.
So it's 20 years out from that. That's why 2043. We have been working on 2038, but there's not a lot of difference between the two dates. So whatever we say about the growth of Asian communities applies to both.
Well, we're going to end up going on 1,000 tangents here, because I was just about to ask you about the census, because no doubt you've been excited to be digging into that. But before we do, so some people may not have listened to the first podcast that we did. If you haven't, go back, because you're going to get some good underlying understanding of what Paul does, Professor Paul Spoonley does, but studies demography and have dedicated effectively your life to this, right?
Yes. Yeah. Just trying to, I'm interested in the social dynamics. I'm interested in how we change as a community or a society, and then I want to look forward. So we had a major project funded by the government called Ngā Tangata Ohu Mairangi, which is what would New Zealand look like in 2038, and that's really interesting.
Yeah. Okay, well, we'll come to that, but the census. So I feel like the data came out a couple of weeks ago, or some things, and it kind of just was like, oh, that's cool, and we carry on. But what was in there that was of interest to you, or you think that we might have missed?
Well, there's three things that Stats New Zealand emphasised. One is that we're becoming a lot older. The second is we're becoming much more diverse. And the third is we grew by 300,000. Now, what I want to do is put a big caveat on that, because the 5 years between the 2018 and then the current census encompassed 2 years of COVID. So a lot of the things that drove population growth in New Zealand, so net migration, tanked. So I think that census covers a very unusual period in New Zealand, because 2 out of the 5 years are COVID years.
So the borders were shut, sort of thing.
Yeah. So I don't think it's typical. I think if we'd not had COVID, we wouldn't have been talking about 300,000. We'd probably be talking about 450, possibly even 500,000 additional people in New Zealand.
Yeah.
Remember last year, we had a net gain from migration of 130,000.
That's in the 2023 calendar year.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, 130,000.
130,000.
So net is people leaving, people coming in, less people leaving.
Yes, it is. Very good, Luke. Very good.
I'm good.
So that's the net. So we grew by 2.8% last year, and 2.4% of that came from net migration. So when we get big spikes in migration and net migration, we get super fast population growth. And I'm sure I said this last time, but I'm going to repeat it. At 2.8%, we were 7 times higher than the average for the OECD. So OECD countries, there's 38 of them, grew by 0.4% last year. We grew by 2.8%.
Well, you'll be proud, mate, because as a nation, we've been building infrastructure at 7 times the speed of other OECD countries. Wow.
Yeah, I still think there's a bit of a challenge, because when you grow by 2.8%, providing houses, providing infrastructure is a big challenge.
Yeah. Especially when we don't seem to be that good at it anyway to then bring in. So then the 0.4%, which is the difference, that is people being born versus people dying. Is that right?
Yes, it is. So that's what's called natural increase.
Yeah.
So natural increase is the number of births over deaths. So for the last 30 years, Germany has had more deaths than births.
Wow.
Yeah.
Every year?
Every year.
Sheesh.
Every year. And the only thing that makes up for that is immigration. And so that's why in 2015, Angela Merkel accepted 1 million refugees to try and encourage population growth, but also to make sure that Germany had enough workers.
I see. So it
had a huge political negative reaction, of course.
Yeah. Did they sort of pick an age range and go, right, and or they just said, right, we'll take 1 million?
We'll take 1 million.
Yeah. And what was sort of the blowback? Because I'm not, obviously you live and breathe this. I'm not very well travelled and cultured. So what was, I can just about guess, but.
Yeah, well, essentially what happened was it was a huge impetus to the far right anti-immigrant, the AfD, the alternative for Germany.
I see.
Yeah. And so they've grown, and the latest elections in Germany in areas like Thuringia have seen AfD as the party that gained the most votes. So it's a very significant shift.
Yeah.
And so the 10 years since 2015 have seen the rise of these anti-immigrant parties in support.
Because sometimes I see people in American politics talking about how they're letting people in to then vote for the party that they like or something. But I didn't even think they were allowed. I don't even know. I didn't think they were allowed to vote. But then it could go the other way anyway. Like you don't know what, like the people that live there at the moment, how they're going to react to it, right?
No. And New Zealand's unusual in that regard, because in most countries you need to become a citizen before you vote. In New Zealand, if we give Luke permanent residence, you can vote.
I see.
And so we're quite liberal on that.
Yeah.
And in fact, my guess is that over the last few years, most of those incoming migrants would have voted Conservative. So the assumptions around who votes and who they vote for, I think there's a lot of mythology. There's a lot of urban myths about it.
Yeah.
And I think we really need to unpack it and understand exactly what's going on.
Interesting. Well, the last time you came here, mate, we were talking about how many people were moving to New Zealand. But since then, I see you've been in hot demand because we're actually seeing a lot of Kiwi citizens say, bye-bye, I am out of here. And a lot of them actually saying, I'm not coming back, which is like I don't like because I like New Zealand.
Yes.
But
me too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What have you sort of made of all of that? Because it all just sort of changed quite quickly from some of the data that I was reading at a high level.
Yeah, it did. So in 2023, we saw over 250,000 migrants arrive, and we saw a net gain of 130,000. So those figures are huge. Even in our history, they are exceptional. And we've flopped. And we do this, I mean, as a country, we do this. We have a spike and then we have a slump. So we're in the slump at the moment. So many fewer migrants are coming. Our net gain is just over 50,000, where it was 130,000, so it's big. But the big story that I think needs more airtime is the 80,000 New Zealanders, mostly New Zealanders, I'll come back to that point, who've left to live permanently in another country. Now, I don't think all of them will live permanently in another country. Some will come back. But 80,000 is a huge outflow. So at the moment, we're seeing a net loss of New Zealand citizens of over 50,000.
Are we not doing any exit interviews or anything?
No.
Yeah, when you lose your job in a corporate, you have to do an exit interview. I had to do a couple of those.
Yeah, do a country exit interview. Yeah.
We're there to find out.
Yeah, so we used to have departure cards. Remember departure cards?
Yeah.
We used to tick them. And so we got a lot of information from those. But at the moment, if you migrate to New Zealand, we know a lot about you. Because, of course, as a condition of your application, we need to know your qualifications, what you're bringing to the labour market, how many of you are coming, all those sorts of details, where you're coming from. We know who's leaving in a broad sense, the numbers, and we know which country they're going to. But after that, our data runs out. We desperately need to know why people leave, where they go, what their intentions are, and we don't know any of that. We know where they're going. We don't know any of that at the moment.
They're going mining in Australia. Is that part of it?
Yes, it is. So about half of those who are leaving are going to Australia.
Okay. And do we know who these people are?
Well, we know one or two things. We know that the largest group of them are in their 20s.
That's not good.
No, it's not good. And we've got those disincentives, such as student loans. And of course, when you don't repay your student loan, it attracts interest.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge disincentive for people to come back. So if you go to Australia, you live there for 5 or 10 years, and you don't pay any of your student debt off, by the end of those 10 years, let's say, it's a hell of a lot bigger. And you, of course, need to pay that back.
Oh, people are worried that they're going to get stopped at the border and someone says, hey, you need to repay this, and they can't afford to do it, or they don't want to let go of the cash.
No. And indeed, that's what border control can do. So your passport would probably be tagged as a person who's not paid their student loan. So if you come back into the country, they can identify you. Yeah.
Okay, so people are going to Australia, half of them, but we don't actually know who these people are. So we can't set up a Google form and send out a survey and say, hey, we need you to fill this out.
It's a good idea. I like that. No, we shouldn't. Kia, which is the Kiwis Abroad organisation, does some work, but we really do need to know, given this huge spike in people leaving, who's leaving. And we've got some data from the past which suggests that we've got the second largest diaspora in the OECD behind Ireland. So that's the number of people living abroad who are New Zealand citizens. So it's north of 1 million people. So 5.3 million here, another 1 million living in another country.
Those are permanent citizens, or
permanent residents, and of course about half of them, but perhaps more, 600,000+ live in Australia.
I see. Yeah.
Now, the difficulty really is we don't have what I would call a diaspora management system. As a country or as a government, we don't actually manage that diaspora particularly well. So if you want an example, Filipinos who come to New Zealand, there's a government department in the Philippines that looks after Filipinos abroad, which connects with them, which makes them feel as though they're part of a Filipino community, even if they're living in New Zealand. And we really don't do that. So yes, America's Cup in Barcelona, the New Zealanders rock up and from other parts of Europe, and they show their solidarity and support. But we really don't manage our diaspora in a way that I think is of benefit to us, because these are skilled people.
Yeah.
And the other thing about them on that skill front is that we know that New Zealand has a disproportionate number of people who are tertiary graduates living abroad.
So they get educated here,
and then they go.
Yeah.
And then they go. And that's the departing New Zealanders in their 20s.
Yeah.
So that's really concerning. I would love us to have more understanding of that and to have a debate about it. What do we do? Perhaps not to stop them going, although that would be part of the debate, but how do we connect with them once they've gone to live in another country?
Gee, I don't want to be accused of being like Chris Luxon, running the country like a corporate boss.
No.
But when I lose a client at Next Advisory, I'm pretty keen to understand how come, what's going on, could we have done anything different? Great, okay, I'm sad to see you go, but you've made the decision, that's fine. But I want to learn from the data so I can figure out, okay, what can we do to stop that? You would think that as a nation, given that we need people to be staying here and how important it is, that we would have some sort of mechanism to collect this data, but we don't.
No.
Wow.
I'm in your corner. I'd love. So incoming migrants, absolutely. We know a lot about them. People leaving, not much. No.
Crazy.
No.
Crazy.
No.
Okay, so we've had there's 80,000 people leaving, which we don't know much about, but we know half of them are going to Australia.
Yes.
And then then it seems like we've turned the tide where all of a sudden maybe the economy's slowed down to a point where less people are coming here as well at the same time.
Yes. So whenever there's economic uncertainty, either internationally or domestically in New Zealand, migration slows.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the nature. I mean, why would you move to New Zealand if there aren't jobs or the economy's not doing as well as you would hope? So, I mean, migrants don't come to New Zealand to make money. They come because of the lifestyle, but still they want to make sure they earn enough money.
Yeah.
And I think at the moment, the signals, there's always push and pull. So there's always reasons why people will leave. And if we get the election of Donald Trump, I would confidently predict that we'll see a spike in the number of Americans wanting to move to New Zealand. So if you remember last time in 2016, in the first 48 hours after it was confirmed that he was president, we had a tripling of the number of Americans who were interested in coming to New Zealand, and it crashed the New Zealand immigration website.
No way.
Yeah. So there's all of those push factors, but we also need the pull factors. We need to be a society which is welcoming but also provides economic opportunities. And if you looked at New Zealand and all the major indicators at the moment, you'd have to say, well, why would I move? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll come for Queenstown. It's great.
Yeah.
That can be it. Can we, I mean, this might sound a bit rash, but do we charge those Americans to come live here if they're going to crash our website?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
It doesn't matter what your visa category is, you pay money.
Yeah.
Yes. And of course, you now pay as a tourist, you now pay
a tax.
$100. Well, yeah, $100. Okay. Yes.
Yeah. But can we, is there room in time to change the settings, for instance, where we say, okay, if you want to move to New Zealand because we become somewhere that people do want to live again, and we say, righto, you can pay to move here?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there are there are investor categories. So if you've got $5 million, you can probably fulfill the conditions of the investor category and you can migrate to New Zealand. You need to demonstrate that you're going to invest in New Zealand, create jobs in New Zealand. But if you've got $5 million, I don't think that would be a hard ask.
Yeah.
So there are categories, there are visa categories which allow you to attract those. I would argue that we're not doing enough.
Yeah.
So there are countries around the world that are doing a lot to attract those high wealth investing New Zealanders. Investing migrants coming to New Zealand to say, well, we want your connections. Can I just say something? The thing about these mobile high wealth migrants is they don't move to New Zealand and stay here permanently. So they're like some of the high wealth migrants that have come here that own property here, but they'll have properties in sort of many countries around the world. So they'll live there and in those other countries for part of the year. So the assumption that they come here, that they're always here,
I see,
long term, all the time, I think is misleading or a misunderstanding of these migrants.
Well, I did go to a conference recently in America, and my mate who works on super yachts, so he's a Kiwi lad, and he's gone and basically worked on super yachts for over the last decade. Been a great way for him to build up some wealth and whatnot and see more of the world. But he was about to take a super yacht from Fort Worth, Miami anyway, that area, and go somewhere I'd never even heard of, and the owner was flying in, and then they would be on the yacht for a few months, and then, but yeah, really opened my eyes going in there to Safe Harbour is the area where we were, of just the amount of these yachts and trying to understand, okay, where are they now, but the crew's working on them and all these sorts of things, but it was just a completely different world.
And we're not cutting edge technology on a lot of things, but in terms of yachts and super yachts, we definitely are. And Barcelona demonstrated that internationally. So there are areas where we provide a disproportionate number of the people who are the investors, the innovators, and the people who work on those yachts. I've just spent the best part of a few months in Sweden at Malmo. What staggered me was the number of New Zealanders I encountered.
Really?
Yeah. So there was somebody who was doing a PhD at Malmo University who's had a very interesting international career and is now doing a higher qualification there. There was a guy who was in a store and Jennifer and I were talking, and he said, "You're a New Zealander." "Yeah, we're a New Zealander." And he had a Swedish partner and is doing some really interesting stuff in terms of firms and helping firms recover or boost their productivity.
Yeah.
Our diaspora contains some wonderfully energetic, innovative, very skilled people.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if we could have a campaign in time to get some of those people back, especially that person, to get them back and teach us about productivity.
Yes.
It would be helpful.
We desperately need something to tell us about productivity. Yes.
I was thinking, if we create so much demand that people want to live here, could we say to some of these wealthy Americans in time, for instance, here's a fast lane to come to New Zealand, it's 10 million US, bang, it goes into an infrastructure fund or something like that. Do you reckon we could make a play like that in time?
I think we could. I mean, we do have some of those options available on the table already. I don't think we use them enough. I'd be cautious. I don't think we want a Peter Thiel situation again, where the guys, I think, spent only a few weeks in the country, and even though he's been given permanent residence here, I'm not sure there's a lot going on. But then you think of James Cameron, you think of a lot of other wealthy Americans who actually do contribute to the New Zealand economy in ways that do live here for part of the year at least. I would like us to begin to be much more strategic around some of this, particularly around new technology. So again, the thing that struck me in Sweden was how they're investing in new clean technologies. Where I was, the whole bus fleet was electric. Wow. Wherever you went were charging stations, whether it was downtown or whether it was the suburbs. It seemed to me that they were promoting new technologies and new economies in a way that we are not at the moment. And it would be good to connect with those people that are doing that and inviting them to contribute to New Zealand in ways that would be of benefit to us.
Yeah, I see Xero, the accounting software, quite often put out data around how much our productivity and GDP would benefit by more small businesses in New Zealand embracing a form of technology. And obviously some people say, well, they're biased because that's obviously what they're selling, but they're not just talking about themselves, they're talking about the add-on partners. And we see it where clients will transition from paper-based payroll software to then doing it online and realizing, oh wow, how have we not been doing this for longer? And it saves them hours and hours in their day, and then they can go and use that time to do something that's going to then grow the business or the economy.
Yes, and I don't want to be promoting Xero necessarily, but they have a great product, and it's a product that's recognised internationally. Yeah, and I just think that's one of those areas where couldn't we roll this out more extensively around New Zealand? And the thing that concerns me, Luke, is that very often it's focused on our big centres, our metropolitan centres, whereas we need that productivity gain. We need that use of technology in our regions and in Palmerston North, in our smaller centres, our mid-sized and our smaller centres.
Yeah.
Because that technology overcomes what's been called the tyranny of distance.
Okay. What is the tyranny of distance?
The tyranny of distance is that Auckland is growing really rapidly, and I don't think New Zealanders quite appreciate it, but the Infrastructure Commission and our work indicates that probably around half of all future population growth will occur in Auckland. So what you get is the combination of migration, and we know that migrants contribute to innovation and creativity, jobs growth, community growth, as in people growth, and the co-location provides what's called an agglomeration economy. So you get these factors feeding into one another, and it becomes self-fulfilling. It becomes a way of generating further growth, and those economies of scale and of agglomeration are not generally available once you get outside the major centres, and by which I think we're talking Christchurch, Wellington, Auckland, increasingly Tauranga and Hamilton, and then after that, it tails off significantly.
It's funny you say that, because I've actually thought about that in my life, and part of why I've moved to Auckland is because I saw more population, just thought, well, then there has to be more opportunity, there has to be more things going on. And sometimes I think, you know what, I don't know if I want to settle down here, but then where would I go? But then, I'm far away from the activity, and it's easy to get a podcast guest like yourself, for instance, compared to, oh, hey, mate, do you want to meet me in Dannyverk or Harbour or Palmy North or whatever, you know?
And how long have you lived in Auckland, Luke?
I'll be coming up a decade, yeah. Yeah.
And so you establish networks.
Yes.
You have access to various forms of expertise, of technology, which you simply wouldn't have. I mean, I think the tyranny of distance, technology overcomes that. So you could still live in Dannyverk.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Dannyverk's a lovely...
Great place.
Yeah. But in fact, the number of people who would be part of the new economy in Dannyverk is always going to be quite small. So technology allows you to connect with those, but you can't have a coffee with them.
Yeah.
You can't. I mean, there's a book called The Geography of Jobs, which looks at the non-economic factors which contribute to big city growth. So it's having a good barista, it's having access to a really good gym, it's being able to go to concerts. You know, there's a whole lot of things that are packaged around a big city lifestyle. So you've got the cost of living in the city, you've got the frustrations that come with traffic, and you know there's some negatives, but ultimately for someone like you, the opportunity to connect with and interact with both in terms of what you do for a job, but also what you do socially is huge. And of course, the thing is, Auckland is so diverse compared to the rest of New Zealand. I mean, well over 40% of Aucklanders are immigrants, whereas for New Zealand as a whole, it's around 27, 28%. Wow. And once you get to those smaller centres, it's much smaller than that. So when we think about migration, and our research, well, the research that was done by some of the team showed that there's a very clear connection between embracing diversity, embracing migrants and what they can contribute, and productivity and economic bottom lines.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have to, right? Because we keep going that way.
Yes, yeah.
I did see a stat that 3/4 of the population will live in the top half of New Zealand by 2040. Maybe the early 2040s.
Yes.
Yeah, 3/4, 75%.
Yes. So that's what we're anticipating as well. That's a Stats New Zealand projection. So 3/4 in the top half of the North Island.
Yes.
So we're not even talking Taupo, we're talking Hamilton North, essentially, Hamilton Tauranga North.
Shit.
And then 40% in Auckland itself. So that's a huge concentration of our population.
Yeah. It almost makes me think, back to the way
I'm going to interrupt you. It need not be that way. We could have government policies which incentivise economic activities in regions in a way that we currently don't. We could have regional economic development as a much more central part of government policy. We could think about what we do to keep people in smaller towns, such as having a good health system, having a good education system, having access to things that you might need. So, I mean, if you look at small town New Zealand, you just see the number of shops closing up. You see the decline of, access to local health care, which essentially means a GP.
Too many of us signed up to a KiwiSaver plan without much thought. And signing up is great, but if you've never got advice before, you could be missing out. Your KiwiSaver account could become one of your biggest assets over your lifetime. That's why getting expert advice early and ensuring you're in the right fund is so worthwhile. Generate have a team of KiwiSaver advisors available to help. Head to generatekiwisaver.co.nz/change to book a no obligation meeting. They can even come to you. A copy of the product disclosure statement is available at generatekiwisaver.co.nz. The issuer of the scheme is Generate Investment Management Limited, and of course, past performance does not guarantee future returns. On that, I was actually talking to a mate in Dannyburg on the weekend, and he was telling me that one of the doctor practices there, you go there, so you present yourself there, but you see the doctor who's online. In India online.
Yes.
I'm like, is this a true story?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So the sort of diagnosis online, I mean, it can work really well. So let's not knock it. But I've spent a week or two in France in a quite remote area. And so they have no local medical facilities. So you go to the community centre and they can hook you up to a machine and you talk to a doctor who's some distance away, and then they can remote diagnose you. So if there's something wrong with you, then you'd have to go to a major centre. And there's a footnote, I'm not sure whether I said this last time, but 2 years ago, the neighbour where we were staying had a heart attack, and it took an hour and a half for emergency services to get there, and she died. So even with emergency services doing the best they could to get there, they were an hour and a half away.
Sheesh. It's too long.
It's too long.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's too long. And if you think about New Zealand and the concentration of specialist medical facilities, particularly in Auckland and Christchurch, that's a concern. Those smaller centres, how do you get access to quality healthcare?
Yeah.
Where is that quality healthcare? What can you get there? I mean, is there an MRI, or do you have to travel 4 hours to Dunedin to get it?
Man, this shit is so complicated because then it just makes me think, well, then as people get older, they're going to need more of that healthcare as well, right? So then it's risky to have your parents living in a different part of the country and they might be 40 minutes to healthcare, for instance. Like it starts to highlight all of those things, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
And if the funding decreases for those sorts of places, then do we have more of those stories, basically?
No, and part of the fastest growing proportion of the population of those aged over 85. And when you get that increase in the over 85 population, you get a tripling of dementia, the incidence of dementia.
I see.
So one question is, where do you put your dementia units? Where can you get support for and care for people who are suffering from dementia?
Yeah. Man.
And it's not in small town New Zealand.
Yeah. Man,
so what do you do?
There's a lot, I think, for younger people to think about with their parents aging and things, because they will at some stage probably have to try and find some of these solutions for their parents, whether we like it or not, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I'm not sure whether we're coming to this, but with the rapid aging of the population, one of the things that we're going to face is increasing fiscal stress on the state. So part of that's superannuation, but the other part of it is the provision of healthcare for an aging population. So suddenly those healthcare costs are going to go up significantly. You know, it's the hip replacement, it's the things of older age, which increasingly become something that needs to be provided. And there are major costs associated with that.
Well, I had to write this down because I didn't want to pretend like I could remember it. But I've got here, in 2020, there were 4 working age New Zealanders to support each person over 65. That was already well down from the 1960s when there were 7 workers per retiree. but it is projected to get much worse. But I don't know why I'm smiling. By the end of the century,
2 to 1.
Yeah, it's forecast that there will be less than 2 working age people to support each person over 65. That's 1.75 people aged 15 to 64 per retiree in 2,100.
Yes.
Jeepers.
I mean, I'm just let's.
How does that play out?
Yeah, well, let's put some qualifications around that because 65 is no longer the age of retirement; it's the age of superannuation eligibility. So,
of course,
it's a ratio between that working age population and those aged over 65. So, leaving aside that, which I think is a technical issue, still important, but a technical issue. So that's called the dependency ratio, and that's the number of people who are in work and paying income tax to support those who are in receipt of superannuation and in need of healthcare and in need of all the other things. When you get a drop from 7 to 1, 7 people in paid work, to 2 to 1, you've got problems.
Yeah.
So how we've funded aged care or superannuation in the past is not going to work, and it's not going to work by the 2030s because that's the Treasury report, which was arguing that, in fact, National are one of the few parties that said that they will increase the age of superannuation eligibility to 67, but in 2044, I think I've got the date right. What Treasury said is that we're delaying the inevitable. We need to address these things now, not let them continue on. So, the age of superannuation eligibility, do we means test it, superannuation? There are a whole lot of questions that we need to have a conversation about because you, Luke, are paying for me, Paul, and my superannuation.
Yeah, I'm pissed off about that.
Yeah, no.
No, I'm trying to cover my mum's one, and my dad's about to turn 65, so I'm trying to sort theirs.
Yes.
But I read today and actually didn't realise this. Is Australia 67? Is that there? Yeah.
If we move to 67 in the 2040s, we'll be one of the last countries in the OECD to do that. Now, it's not unproblematic because both Japan and France have tried to increase, the conditions around superannuation, or pensions as they would call them. And France has quite a complicated graduated scheme. So it actually starts at age 60 but then continues on. And there has been quite a major reaction to changing that, and there would be in New Zealand, I am sure. But essentially, how we currently fund super is not going to be sustainable in the long term. So again, that Treasury report indicated that there would be an increase around 50% in the cost of superannuation as a proportion of GDP. And the Cullen Fund, the superannuation fund, which is quite substantial, would only cover about a quarter of that increase.
Yeah.
So how do we fund the rest of it?
Yeah. Yeah. Do you want the answer? I don't
yes.
know.
No.
Yeah. Well, let's start by charging those wealthy Americans.
Yes. Well, the thing is that we're one of the few countries that doesn't have a wealth tax or a capital gains tax. So we do need to have that conversation, and it flips in and then flips out of the political debate really quickly.
Yes.
But if the ratio is going to end up as being 2 to 1 in terms of people in work compared to those on superannuation, we need to think about alternatives for the state to generate a tax base that will allow us to provide adequate health care and I think superannuation is really important. When you reach 65, I want you to have access to superannuation. I think that's a right of New Zealanders. But what conditions do we put about? So if you're a billionaire at age 65, why should you receive superannuation?
Yeah. So we could be looking at means testing, but we could probably already be having that conversation, right?
We should be. We should be. And I think your generation is raising it increasingly. It's my generation that are quite often reluctant to consider changing it. We see it as something that we've earned, that we've paid tax for. Yeah,
I've heard that a few times.
Yeah. But we're going to have that conversation. And I agree entirely with Treasury that because it's not immediately an issue, we can delay having that conversation. I don't think we can.
Yeah, well, I kind of think this is a little bit left field, but if we're going to have a capital gains tax, why don't we phase it in by age? Now, I know that won't be popular,
Okay.
but I kind of think, well, then let's not go to all of the youngsters like, oh, hey, now you've got another tax that you have to get used to. We say, well, actually, if we're saying as a nation that we are running out of money or that we haven't provided well enough, then we're going to add a capital gains tax, but we're going to phase it in from age. So then the older people, you have to go first.
Yes.
Now, some people might say, well, that's just effectively then a wealth tax, and maybe it is. But I sometimes play with just random tax things in my head and think, what would happen? But if we said to younger people, hey, there's going to be a capital gains tax past this age to phase it in, and it will slowly change. But then younger people, we're going to decrease your income tax so that you've got more of your pay left over. Then you're going to feel like you are getting ahead a bit faster because you're not having to pay as much income tax. So we're going to prevent you from wanting to go to Australia and things like that. Whether we need to do something that's actually a bit more, like I feel like we always just want to tinker with things.
Yes.
Maybe we do need something radical, tell the story well, and then just get on with it.
Yeah. And I was offered a job a few years ago in Australia, and until I offered that job, I didn't realise about the add-ons. So I would get a car, which would be discounted over 3 years, and at the end of it, I would own the car.
Yeah.
But what really struck me was how much the employer was paying for my superannuation.
Yeah.
And so you might have seen recently Shamabu Yacob, who's been appointed to help one of the banks with some advice, saying, why don't we have a 6% contribution from the employee and 6% from the employer? And suddenly the whole possibility of saving for your retirement changes significantly. And I listened to Sam Stubbs and his commentary around the banks, and you know the fact that the banks, or one particular bank, seems to have withdrawn from higher risk investments, particularly in commercial and rural activities, and as funding home ownership. Now, I think home ownership is super important, but I would hate to think of as disproportionately funneling active capital into home ownership or into ownership of multiple properties, rather than into economic activities, which are going to contribute quite differently to our economy. So I just think we probably haven't got quite the right settings. And of course, to come back to my expertise, because some of this is way beyond me, but demography does matter, and it's going to matter even more over the next 10, 20 or 30 years. And a lot of these debates we're going to have because we're going to have to think about our tax base in order to provide you, Luke, with healthcare as you hit those 60s, 70s and 80s.
Well, we'll come back to some of the financial side of it, because I've got a good question that's non-financial, but I think equally is important and ties in from this. But very quick story for you. The banks absolutely prioritise lending towards property. I had a client recently who they've got the ability to buy a machine from overseas. It's probably $250,000, and they've got a very profitable business already. It'll be one of the only ones in New Zealand. It will allow them to do a whole heap of stuff that they currently can't do. It's quite scary for them, $250,000. I'm like, don't worry, we'll finance it, we'll discuss the rate, and we'll try and work together to pay this off as fast as possible. And you can get out there and you can use it, and then it'll be paid off, and then the debt's not so scary. Does the application? No, declined. I'm like, no, not declined. I'm like, hang on, why declined?
Yes.
I'm like, no, we will be buying this. Someone will be financing this, but the banks first look at it as no. Wow. And I'm like, we go to them and say, actually, look at the equity they have in their property. They're like, sorry, of course we can lend that. But the conversation is going to be, no, you said no to start with. Yeah. What's broken in your process? Yeah. Because another bank is going to do this. Yeah. But I see it all the time. We definitely, as a nation, prioritise investing in property over business, and I think that's part of how we've got to the predicament that we are in, is that the settings have been so one way for property. And the way that money flows into things, as soon as there's some security against a property and bricks and mortar, it's like, yep, great, we can lend you for your business, but you must have property that we can take off you if it fails first. But I'm watching a building in front of me at the moment from my apartment, and it's just been like taken down. And it's such a weird concept, because you look at that and you think, that's probably $8 million worth of building. Yeah. and I think they'll probably take 2 weeks and it'll be gone.
Wow.
And you think, far out, but they'll rebuild there
Yeah.
and there'll be something else. But once upon a time, that was someone's pride and joy and that was worth millions of dollars.
Yes.
And then all it takes is a digger just to go.
Yeah.
So those things I think aren't really worth what we think that they are worth. No. But that just seems to be how the financial system works, which is, fascinating.
Well, I mean, that's your area of expertise, but I would again come back to you and say our demography means that we do need to think about how we generate tax to cover off an ageing population.
Yes.
And to provide all the things that governments should do. I mean, we can talk about the limits of what they should provide, but the fact is an ageing population needs healthcare. Well, and so how are you going to pay for that?
Yeah, let's come back to that and some of Treasury's report. But what I was going to ask you is then, okay, so if we end up with a ageing population and more people who need healthcare, like what does New Zealand need to look like in order to actually look after all of these people? And that's sort of what we were touching on before, right, of the access to healthcare and stuff. Do we need to be setting up the nation now saying, well, actually by 2040, let's say, we're going to be 4,000 nurses short, or we're going to be XYZ beds short, or we're going to be 13 dementia wards, that don't even exist. And it was almost like, when COVID hit, we were like, shit, we better have some sort of facility that we can go to if need be.
Yeah.
But I saw the other day of that massive hurricane in America.
Yeah.
Now, what really impressed me was all the coverage was about how it was about to hit. And then they just cut to the stadium. And it was set up ready to go for people who were going to lose their home and all this. I'm like, wow, that would never happen in New Zealand, at the scale that it was. It was very impressive how ready they were to respond. Yeah.
So we can take all of that and we can look at it individually. So if I take something like critical care beds, so we're going to, as an ageing population, we need long-term critical care. We will need 12,000 beds. So who pays for that?
Yeah.
And where are they located? And we can continue on with those sorts of examples. It's not going to come as a surprise that if we think about 10 years' time, 2034, 20 years' time, 2044, what the country will look like and what the needs will look like. So we've actually got quite reasonable data around all of that. What's missing is what is the private sector, what is local government, what is national government going to provide? And none of that's particularly clear. So you've taken dementia units, and we're going to see hyper-aging in parts of New Zealand, the Coromandel, for example. When I say hyper-aging, I'm talking about 30, 35, 40, possibly 45% of the population being aged over 65, and increasingly that population being aged over 85. So what we know, to go back to something I've already talked about, is that when you see that increase, you know that there's going to be a tripling of dementia.
I see.
And in the Coromandel, what does dementia care look like? And that's a question you'd ask around a lot of New Zealand in terms of what that looks like, who provides it, who pays for it. We know what's coming down the pipeline. My frustration is that we have a 3-year political cycle, which really doesn't think long-term in that way and which is not preparing it. I've just come from the UK. I've come from Sweden via the UK. By the end of this year, they're hoping to have increased the nursing workforce by almost 40,000, and that's a 2-year project. If they do that, and I don't think they will, then they'll still be 30,000 nurses short. So we've got healthcare shortages beginning to emerge now. We've got issues around, that unit at North Shore Hospital, which was built and then you couldn't actually occupy it because there were other things that were missing. So we've got if you take healthcare, we've got a complex system. We've got a system which needs to think about where you locate facilities and how do you invest in new technology, because that technology is coming along all the time. And it's prolonging life, which is good. But how are we going to fund the healthcare system that you, Luke, are going to expect once you hit your 60s and 70s?
I feel like we're just going to end up borrowing a stack of money as a nation.
Yes.
We're a bit of a one-trick pony because I don't feel like we've got any other answers.
No. Well, the answers are, to go back to a conversation we've already had, how do we increase our tax take?
Yeah.
Do we go for foreign investment? Do we go for a mixture of public-private partnerships? There are a lot of options on the table, but we don't seem to be considering or taking those options in the way that would provide us with a healthcare system which is fit for purpose.
I think even at an individual level, in the meantime, people could, like, once you understand this and then think about maybe the risks for your family or even your own health or access and things like that, I think there's a lot of wastage in all of our households of stuff that we buy and go, you know what, like, if you fast forward 10 years and your parents are in a position where they're going to need financial support or whatnot, and you go, did I really need a dog or a cat or a whatever, right? And these are hard things because we kind of think, well, why shouldn't we? But I think everything's always easy in hindsight. And we go, man, why did I buy all of that stuff? And I watched a young guy the other day talking about in his 20s buying 20 grand worth of, status symbol type clothing and then, getting 4 years down the path going, why the hell did I buy this shit? And, then selling it. But it's almost like there's a little bit of that too. Some of us need to just sharpen up a little bit and go, you know what, I think we're hell bent on sort of, maximizing every dollar we have instead of going there. You used to hear this back in the day all the time, but we don't talk about it anymore. It's like save for a rainy day. Mm-hmm. And I feel like New Zealand's got a lot of bloody thunderstorms and rainy days coming.
Yeah. And I mean, KiwiSaver is great because it's forced savings, but we're not good savers apart from that, and we need to be. But the difficulty is, I mean, if you're a 20-something and you've put aside some money into KiwiSaver, and you've got to buy a house, particularly in our metropolitan centres, where do you get the capital from if you're not going to take out your KiwiSaver funds? Yeah. So it becomes a really tricky journey. And I don't think our financial literacy as individuals or as families is particularly good.
No. Well, we're trying to help people here do a little bit of that. But I do think as well the exciting thing, just to be positive, by 2100, when we are at the point where we've got 1.75 people aged between 15 to 64 per retiree, 2100 is actually quite a long way away.
It is.
And KiwiSaver is going to be a big pot of cash. And I do think that over the next 60 years, we will see some change in those settings where we go, maybe we say, for instance, you know what? If you want to be a KiwiSaver provider, that it's now regulated, 15% of your funds have to be invested into New Zealand. And here's the regions. People are going to get, that'll be...
Yeah, and I would put some conditions around that 15%. So it's not going to be housing necessarily.
Yeah.
Or it could be new forms of housing, co-housing.
Yeah.
Forms, housing where you are not the owner, but you're a tenant. And the thing that struck me in Europe, in Malmo, where I was, there weren't any individual houses really. Nearly everything was apartment building, and it's a different model. You've got a tenancy agreement for life, and that includes your retirement phase. But with that 15% has got to go into productive investment, things that are going to contribute to our economy and increasing the economic pool.
Yeah. See, I even think if we now, and maybe this exists and I don't know about it, but I should, if we had a New Zealand Inc. fund where you could invest into that and these are the projects, I would chip away at that as someone who's got capital to be able to do that and go, that's pretty cool if I know that actually by contributing to that. And I mean, there's some KiwiSaver providers that are doing some stuff in that space, but I can picture in my head going into the Harwood Z station, paying for my gas, and then you get a couple of tokens and you go, I'm going to donate my token to that project.
Yes.
I thought that's really cool. You know? And I think if we, even I thought, regionally and then nationwide, if there were things where, the other day we were arguing about should we have the America's Cup or whatnot.
Yep.
Personally, I'm like, we should be having a conversation of like, how do we make this happen? And how do we make sure we make money from it? How do we ensure that it doesn't lose money and it's net positive wealth-wise for the country, et cetera? We get more eyeballs down here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But okay, it is going to cost. And you know what? We've set up a fund and you can put a little bit in and that's going to contribute to it. And if we get to X amount, the government's going to contribute that, but we're going to run an open P&L on that, profit and loss. And we're going to actually ensure that this is guaranteed to be profitable for the nation and we've got something we can be excited about, et cetera, whether we could play with things like that.
Yeah. And the last time we really had that conversation was under the Helen Clark government and the knowledge wave.
Okay.
And we really haven't had that conversation. I mean, we tinker. See, I'd love, and I'm not sure whether I mentioned this last time, but I would love two things. One is I'd love us to have a population policy.
Yes.
How do we grow, and whether growth, what sort of level of growth is required? But we need to talk about the declining fertility, rapid aging. We need to talk about the geographical location of the population, and then how do we provide the services and infrastructure for that population. I would love us to have regional economic development policies so that, Auckland will grow whatever happens unless government tries to change that growth trajectory. But if we're thinking about some of the regions, there are some good economic development agencies in those regions, by the way, but why don't we have a national regional development strategy, which includes looking at people, population, and includes maximising those economic returns and investments locally?
Yeah. Yeah, I like it, eh? I sometimes think I wouldn't mind moving to a region and then maybe it's the last 20 years of my life and it's like help cool shit happen in that region.
Yes.
I really like. Back to Palmy, maybe, Manawatu, maybe.
Yeah.
What I was going to say, just this comes to my mind, and I don't want to derail us back to a capital gains tax, but I actually don't reckon a capital gains tax will be voted in because I do think that, like you say, your age group and demographic and whatnot will drag their heels because I saw something interesting because I thought maybe we're getting closer. But I don't like, this sounds bad, but I can't trust the politicians. I thought Jacinda Ardern was the most popular one ever. I thought she'll do it. No. And then Hipkins like, we'll do it. Oh, no, actually we won't.
No.
And Lux is like, we're not doing it. And then Hipkins is like, we're going to do it. I'm like, oh, come on. You're taking the piss at this rate.
Yeah.
But what I saw the other day was a town hall back towards where I used to live in Dannyburg, and the anger about a toll.
Yes, and on the road toll. Yeah, saw that.
And that was enough for me to go, you know what, like, I don't think we're at the stage where you can just add more tax into people's lives. Now, I've read more about it, and I got someone who's very good at comms to brief me on what they did wrong and poorly and why people are angry, so I get it. But I still think that it'd be very hard to convince the people of wealth or even, just people in general that's a good idea. Even if we can't convince people like, hey, we should add a toll road so that we could have, a better road up to the north and we can unlock economic activity up there and that's better for the entire country. Be like, I'm not paying for that.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting.
There's a lot of NIMBYism, isn't there? That's like...
is it like not in my backyard?
Yeah, not in my backyard. And in this case, it's whatever the equivalent term is for tax revenue increases.
Well, we could call it NOMBY. Oh, not out of my bank. Oh, no, NOMBA. Not out of my bank account.
Yeah, no, good. The thing about capital gains tax is that if you look around the high income world, there are very good models. So it doesn't affect your personal apartment or home. It's limited in terms of what you can tax in terms of a second property. So it's not an unusual concept, except it is in New Zealand.
Yeah.
And I don't know how we get to the point of maturity where we're saying, well, if we go to your figure that you've repeated twice now, which is the dependency ratio of 2 to 1, how do we find alternatives to income tax revenue in terms of providing things that you are going to need?
Yeah.
You're going to need them.
Yeah.
And so if you rock up to your local hospital and you can't get the health service that you require, think back to the moment where you said, no way am I going to pay a capital gains tax to try and spread the tax base of the government in the 2020s.
Yeah. we got some fascinating times to come.
Yes.
My mind as well just went to, if we've got 80,000 younger people leaving, then I think New Zealanders have this thing of like, New Zealand's amazing, they'll always come home.
Yep.
But actually, I was talking to a multi-millionaire recently and their kids have left and they said, oh, we're going to leave too. It's kind of lonely here. Cool to have all this cool shit and have made this money, but you know what, we're out of here.
Yes.
Because they want to be closer to their kids. And I wonder if some people will go, oh, well, maybe our kids aren't going to come home. Maybe we will.
Yeah.
As well.
Can I just, I'm quite passionate about this, but The immigration
tell.
system, the immigration system operates what they call a centre of gravity. So if the proportion of your family are here in New Zealand, then you can make a case to bring your parents here. So you're members of your extended family here because the bulk of you already live here. So can we bring them across? Now, there are all sorts of conditions about that. You can't be a drain on the health system. You've got to have health insurance and so on. But what I don't think we've understood is that the reverse applies, that the centre of gravity is in Brisbane and that Luke's kids, let's say, Luke's kids have moved there and the grandkids are there. So why am I living in Auckland when I can move to Brisbane and be near the family? So I think for increasing number of families, the centre of gravity is not in New Zealand anymore. It's overseas. And when I'm looking forward to the breakdown of migration to Australia, because I think, yes, it's the 20-something who's going, but I also think we'll see the 60-plus migration to Australia too, to be near
kids.
And grandkids.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So I just, again, I think we need to rethink what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, because we're going to have to accept that, your example of the really wealthy guy moving and taking his or her capital, his or her knowledge, all those connections, perhaps selling up and moving overseas. I don't think we can afford to do that.
No, we don't want to lose them.
No.
Yeah. Okay, I've derailed us about 1,000 times, but I did want to say, so in the Treasury report, which I was reading through, and I'm sure you probably correct me on some of these stats if I've got them wrong, but the key findings, I asked ChatGPT to summarise it for me.
Yes. Good.
So here's 5. The first one, New Zealand's ageing population will significantly pressure public finances, increasing healthcare and pension costs. Tick, would agree.
Yeah, and what I will talk about increasingly is the fiscal stress that's going to come on the government to try and meet the needs of an ageing population.
Yeah, we're going to have those conversations going to get louder and louder, and they'll be key voting issues, I'd imagine, right? As more people understand it?
Yes.
Or do you think we'll sweep it under the rug?
No, well, let's go back to something I think we both agreed upon before, and that is we tend to defer those major debates.
Wait for a crisis.
Yeah,
then we can talk about it.
Yeah, and it'll be too late.
Yeah. And it'll be knee-jerk. Okay, so then number 2 is without intervention, structural deficit. So that basically means that the country is spending more than it has, and rising debt levels are expected, and that's kind of what we thought. Okay.
Yes, and what we're seeing that is, the decision not to proceed with the new Dunedin Hospital.
Yeah.
The issue around water safety and management. So Three Waters didn't go down well with the electorate, but we desperately need some sort of infrastructural investment. I mean, I just can't believe here in Auckland that we don't have a rail system to the airport. I mean, I've spent the last 2.5 months travelling around Europe. There is not a single major centre that doesn't have rapid and easy access via train to the major airport.
Tell you a quick story. I had my mum come and stay recently and her friend, and we're in Takapuna, and they mapped the journey to the airport. They got to mine. They said, we're going to Uber to the ferry, we're going to ferry over to the city, and then we're going to walk to the train terminal, and then we're going to catch the train down to Manukau, I think, and then we're going to get on the bus, and that'll take us to the airport. So we'll be here at 8 a.m. tomorrow. The flight's at 1. I'm like, oh my gosh. I said, no. I said, let's just Uber you over to Sky City and you can catch the bus from there. No, we've got a plan. We're sticking to the plan. I'm thinking, holy. Okay, number 3, policy adjustments are necessary, such as changes to superannuation eligibility and investment in healthcare efficiency. So this is Treasury. Like Treasury, they advise the government, right? Yes. So they do studies and they basically say, hey guys, like here's what we're finding. You need to be thinking about this stuff. Like they can't make these changes.
No, and I think that Treasury report that you and I have read, I think is an excellent report. The Retirement Commission last year had an equally significant report, and it came out and said that we need a discussion around exactly those things you've just mentioned, and we need multi-party agreement to have that discussion without unnecessarily politicising it.
Nice. So then we don't get to the next election and change it all. It's like, no, we're all on the same page. We've got to keep going with this.
Absolutely. I agree. I think Treasury have hit the, or your chat
GPT. I hope it summarised it well. Yes. Number 4 is productivity growth is vital to manage these fiscal challenges sustainably.
Yes.
I think we know.
And can I just say that we've tended to use immigration as a driver of economic growth as an alternative to productivity gains. We've got to rethink that.
Well, even I guess that doctor working in New Zealand from India is a good example of, creating access via technology and productivity, right? And I even think about it for myself. Sometimes I don't go and see the doctor because my sister is a nurse, and I will basically, send her a photo of what's going on. She's like, "Jeepers, what are you doing?"
Get to a doctor straight away. Yeah.
She's like, "Oh, that's just this, bro. Go to the chemist and whatever." And it's like, "Oh, okay." So then that's one less person that then is into the health system saying to my doctor, like, "Oh, hey, can I have 30 minutes of your time?" They get there and they're like, "Oh, mate, like you could have just." But even I did a phone consult recently with my doctor.
Did you?
Which then saved, and she said, "Well, don't come here because you sound ill, and we don't want to expose that to other things." And I've done a physio consult via video once well.
Yeah. And so we just stayed with friends over the last weekend in London, and that's exactly what happens. So what they get is Luke rings up and says, leaves a message and says, this is what I think is happening. I'm feeling lethargic or whatever. And then what they do is they triage it. So they might say, "Come in, we need to see you." Or the doctor might ring you and say, "Can I talk to you further about it?" Or a nurse might ring you and say, "What's happening?" Or they might say, "Look, a pharmacy." Yeah. So the technology gets used in a different, with our interaction with the health system becomes quite different because, of course, what you can do, I've got a friend who has a heart condition, and the little thing that keeps him ticking, the heart ticking, each night he puts his phone next to the bed and it downloads information about the heart to the phone, and that gets sent to his cardiologist. So he can say, in the last 24 hours, you've had an incident with your heart. We need to do something with your medication or surgery or whatever it is. Outstanding. But we're going to have to think about that. But that's a cost.
Yeah.
We're going to have to think about what we do. And just on the anecdotal stuff, I recently had surgery for a tumour which was benign, thankfully. The nurses, 2 of them were Filipinos, 1 was South African, the anaesthetist was Indian, and the surgeon was Chinese. I had fantastic service. They were brilliant. But it just reinforced to me how reliant we are on immigrants to run our healthcare system.
I'll double down on that. Had the same thing in my family where, couldn't believe it. I kind of thought, holy shit, we're going into a war zone, going into this hospital and whatnot. Service was amazing. Yes. People were actually happy. They were really helpful. They're so thorough. They were caring. Yeah. I'm like, oh, okay, this is good. This is kind of not what I thought was going to be happening. But you're right. They do a great job in there, and it must be so hard because it's just relentless as well. Point 5 is the Treasury is developing new models to better forecast and plan for long-term fiscal impacts. Yes. So maybe they said that in the report and it picked up on it. So, okay.
And so again, what I would want to say is, Luke, can we please have, as part of that, a population policy projections and the implications of our changing population on whatever we're talking about?
Yeah. Because on that, I wonder, at the moment where we've got population aging,
yes,
and then fertility declining,
yes,
if I remember rightly,
yep,
and it's like at record lows, right?
Yes.
So then, do we get to a point where if we don't have people wanting to move to New Zealand, we actually have then a declining population?
Yep.
Yeah.
And so one of the banks, one of their forecasts is that by next year, our immigration will be in negative territory. So more people will be leaving than arriving. That is disastrous. That is, people say, well, we shouldn't have population growth for its own sake. And I agree entirely. I think what we should do is say, well, what proportion of our population growth should come from immigration? I read an op-ed which suggested that we could reverse fertility decline. Not going to happen.
I remember from the first episode, you said
not
you
going to
can't really
happen.
incentivise it.
Not going to happen. Yeah. And Sweden, where I've just been, they provide parents with 480 days paid leave for each child.
Wow.
And they've just allowed 45 of those days to be allocated to grandparents. So grandparents would be paid up to 45 days for looking after children. The fertility rate in Sweden is exactly the same as it is in New Zealand. So even with those very generous provisions, they're still not able to change the dial in terms of fertility.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
And no one's really succeeded at trying to boost fertility.
No.
Yeah.
But we're not having a conversation about what the implications are.
Yeah. I feel like we're going to have to soon.
We are. We are.
We're trying to get them going.
Yes.
I'll just see if I've missed anything. But yeah, okay, so 40% of people are going to live in Auckland. I think I wrote that down from you saying that before.
And that's not inevitable, just to interrupt you. It's not inevitable, but that's what we're forecasting, because the majority of our population growth will come from net immigration. And we know that up to 60% of migrants go to Auckland. So that's why we're forecasting that sort of population growth.
I saw a note in some of your recent notes, and there was a point I wanted to make sense of it. Institutions closing could be a risk. Schools, libraries. I wrote libraries, but I don't think you had that, like medical centres. What did you mean by that? Is that regionally?
Yes. So if you look at the last 2 decades, there have been almost 200 schools closed down in New Zealand. Now, they're not closing in Auckland because we're having to grow our school provision. But when you get into regional New Zealand, then you're seeing those sort of core institutions in the local community. So there's an example of a community that's got a $400,000 package to attract a GP, and they can't. They just can't get anybody to go there. So if you've not got a decent school, including a secondary school and healthcare, and you can't buy adequate food, alcohol, whatever, in the local community, what's going to retain people there, or what's going to attract people there? So that sort of institutional structure in smaller town New Zealand, as it closes down, becomes a real incentive for people to move.
Interesting. I was just thinking, this goes back a little while ago from what we were talking about, but because one thing I do think that saves us or will help is that, I know we can talk about a capital gains tax and a wealth tax, but I do think that some of those wealthy people, even if we don't have one, let's say the politicians can't get it through or flip-flop on it for the 68th time, that I do think we have a lot of wealthy people in New Zealand who are very, very generous.
Yes.
And I think that if we set up the infrastructure for them to say, look, these are our 4 critical issues, and it might be like education, infrastructure, healthcare, and something else, let's say, I reckon there'll be people that step in and go, I'm planting $1 million in, for instance, or like I've just finished up a meeting where basically with one of my clients with the work that they do some amazing work. I won't say what, but someone's just rang them and said, oh, hey, we've just put you in our will for 70,000. We just had to let you know. Yeah. And I do think we've got a lot of that coming, because I think there is a lot of the wealth that's tied up, but it's just waiting to sort of transition. Yeah, no,
I agree with you. I've just been at Outward Bound in Anakiwa, and I didn't realise how much the J.R. Mackenzie Trust, the Wolf Fisher Trust, Sir David Levine had funded that.
Yeah.
And that's fantastic. And I would give a shout out to Ashburton, who have the Ashburton Trust, which I think has got about 25 million in it, all donated by local people to help the community survive and flourish.
I love that shit.
I know. I think it is fantastic. I think it's really good. And I went down to talk to them a few years ago, and the other guy that was there had trained as a doctor and been helped by this Ashburton Trust, and then decided he didn't want to be a doctor any longer, and so he was becoming a composer as of music, classical music. And the community was still supportive, and people there were really, behind investing in their local community. Yeah. So I think there are good examples of that. It just probably doesn't happen as much as we would like it to happen.
And I think as well, like once people do well or have means or are wealthy, you kind of then hide a little bit, because it's, in New Zealand, it's like, oh, someone's going to have a crack at me. I saw someone donate a lot of money during COVID, and someone's like, well, of course they can. They've got heaps. And it's like, that's kind of not really the point. They didn't have to. But
no.
I'll tell you this actually, because you'll laugh. I was cleaning out my car, and it's not even that dirty anyway, but I pulled out this pamphlet and I took it up and I put the things in the bin, and I was like, oh, It's a Massey alumni newsletter. And I go to the back and it's saying, oh, we're going to have a shortage of nurses.
Yep.
We're looking for people to donate to help subsidise some of these people study to be nurses. I'm like, oh, brilliant. I'm going to donate a bit of coin to this. And I'm like, oh, shit, it's from 2022.
Yeah.
Like I must have got it. It must have been sent to my parents and I put it in there and I just, had only just opened it or something.
And the thing is, Luke, we're going to have these repeat conversations year after year after year. So if it's 2022, it's exactly the same message in 2024, and it will probably be the same message in 2030.
Yeah.
So we just what frustrates me is we don't have that longer term horizon in New Zealand, 10, 20, 30 years. And I think, to go back to where we started this conversation, big ups to people like Stephen Tyndall and the Tyndall Foundation. They are doing this, and it just frustrates me that we don't do it as a country, or governments don't do it.
Yeah, I guess what I was going to say is like there are people trying to do good stuff out there, and even Massey, for instance, like doing that in 2022, and like you say, some of these things are going to be ongoing. But we had a guest in here recently, and they help people get out of debt faster by basically buying the debt off of the high interest-bearing debt companies that have given debt to these people. And so Money Sweet Spot give these people a money reset. So they go, right, we'll go and pay it all off for you, but now you owe us, but the rate's lower. And if you educate yourself, we give you credits and it pays down faster. The Tyndall Foundation, bang, here's $5 million.
Oh, did they?
Go and deploy that.
Did they? Oh,
so they had $5 million bucks of, minted cash to be able to go out there and do that. So I think, I still feel like we've got a wave of wealth to come through this country. And I think people will probably self-tax and they'll direct it to what they care about. But I do think it's something that we don't know how to talk about that well. And I read there's a philanthropist in Wellington and they don't have children and they're donating their whole fund to like Wellington Inc. or something like that. And shit, it looks like they need it at the moment, to be honest.
No, absolutely. No, absolutely.
But I don't think it saves us.
But I just think that should be invested in things that innovate and create socially, economically, and it's getting that balance right and getting where are we going to invest? Yeah.
Well, there's going to be a lot of places that need money, but as always, mate, a fascinating conversation. I took us in all sorts of different tangents. Is there anything that you had in these notes that I didn't get to?
No, I mean, I would end with just saying, let's continue the conversation about population alongside the sort of economic issues we've traversed. And it would be really good for people who listen to this to think about our community in 10 or 20 or 30 years' time, because it's going to be a very different New Zealand. And a lot of the things that we've done in the past are simply not going to work. So how do we get that innovation into the economy, but how do we get it into policy thinking? How are we going to do things differently? What's that going to look like? And I mean, I think we share the frustration that, I would love to have a conversation about capital gains tax, but we don't seem to want to have that conversation in a serious way. We need to have those conversations.
It's almost like we want to argue as a country around a capital gains tax, but we need to actually have a conversation around the things above it and how real they are as to, okay, well, if it's not a capital gains tax, then you need to bring some solutions to the table, or like, okay, or you need to accept this is what it could look like for your parents, and then figure out, because I don't think we do a great job in New Zealand of doing what you're trying to do, which is basically paint the picture of, this is where we're going. It's actually quite clear and this is what it could look like. And therefore, what we do today isn't going to work in that time.
And, congratulations on the podcast, because what I think we often lack is good evidence. We've got a lot of opinion and we've got a lot of anecdote, and we tend to go with that in terms of sometimes public discussions, sometimes government decision-making. What this does is put some of that evidence on the table for people to think about. We don't have to agree politically, but we do need to reach some point where we can move forward. And it just doesn't feel as though we're moving forward in the way that is very helpful at the moment.
Yeah. Well, hopefully that changes, but no doubt people have learnt a lot through the last hour and a bit. Thanks as always, mate. I'm sure that if we catch up in 6 months' time, these problems wouldn't have been solved, but there'll be more to talk about in terms of, who's coming to New Zealand, who's going and whatnot. But yeah, I'm going to try and maybe start a petition to find out who these 80,000 people are so we can get some exit interviews come to the country.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, mate. And we'll see you next time.
Okay. Thanks, Luke.